Imagine being one decision away from losing everything. Your career, your freedom, your future. What would you do if you were given a second chance, but knew it could be your last? Stick around, because this story will take you on a roller coaster of regret, fear, and redemption. Officer Brian was known in the neighborhood. He always had a smug look on his face, a look that said he was in charge, that he could do anything he wanted. It was a quiet afternoon, and Brian was driving his patrol car, slowly rolling down the street, scanning for trouble. That's when he saw him, a well-dressed black man walking calmly down the sidewalk. Something inside Brian stirred. His eyes narrowed as he watched the man. He didn't know him, but in Brian's mind, that didn't matter. The man looked out of place. Brian pulled his car over and got out, swaggering over like he owned the world. His hand rested on his belt as he approached the man. His chest puffed out. "Hey, you! What are you doing around here?" Brian's voice had a sharp edge. The man looked at him, calm and polite. "Just walking, officer. Is there a problem?" Brian didn't like that answer. He didn't like how calm this man was. People usually acted scared when he talked to them, especially people like him. He took a step closer, staring him down. "You look suspicious," Brian sneered. "Show me your ID." The man sighed softly, but still, he remained calm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his ID. Brian glanced at the ID but didn't really read it. He was already convinced. In his mind, this man had to be guilty of something. "You're coming with me," Brian said, grabbing the man's arm. The man didn't resist, but as Brian started to pull out the handcuffs, he said something that made Brian pause for a moment. "Officer, do you know who I am?" Brian ignored him. "Doesn't matter who you are. You're under arrest for suspicious behavior." His voice was filled with power, his grip tightening on the cuffs. The man didn't fight back, but as Brian snapped the cold steel around his wrists, something in the air shifted. For a split second, Brian felt a strange chill run down his spine. This wasn't like his usual arrests. Something felt off, but Brian pushed the feeling away. In his mind, he was always in control. As they headed back to the patrol car, the man, Mr. Evans, remained silent, his face calm but unreadable. Brian, however, still had that smug feeling in his chest, confident that he had just done his job. But as they drove toward the police station, that uneasy feeling began to grow, creeping into his thoughts like a shadow. What Brian didn't know was that this arrest would change everything. Officer Brian walked into the station, leading Mr. Evans through the door with the same smugness he always carried. He didn't think much about the whispers that began as soon as they entered. Some of the officers who were usually chatty suddenly went quiet, and others glanced away, as if they didn't want to make eye contact with him. Brian brushed it off. They were probably just surprised he brought someone in so quickly. He walked Mr. Evans over to the booking desk, where Officer Jenkins was standing. Jenkins looked at Mr. Evans, then at Brian, and his face turned pale. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Jenkins awkwardly cleared his throat and stepped back, letting Brian handle the paperwork. Brian filled out the arrest form, feeling a small flicker of irritation. Why was everyone acting so weird? He glanced over at Mr. Evans, who stood perfectly still, his eyes calm, watching everything but saying nothing. There was something unsettling about the way he just waited. Just as Brian was finishing up the paperwork, the door to the captain's office flew open, and Captain Thompson stormed out. His face was red with anger, his eyes locked on Brian like lasers. The room seemed to freeze. Every officer in the station turned to watch what would happen next. "Brian," the captain barked, his voice echoing across the room. "Get over here. Now." Brian felt a wave of confusion wash over him. What had he done? He straightened his shoulders and walked over, trying to maintain his usual confidence. "What's the problem, Captain?" "Just brought in a suspect." Captain Thompson's eyes flashed with fury. "Suspect? He jabbed a finger toward Mr. Evans, who was still standing by the desk, completely calm, his hands cuffed in front of him. "Do you know who that is?" Brian blinked, unsure how to respond. He glanced over at Mr. Evans, who met his gaze with a look that seemed to hold all the answers that Brian didn't want to hear. Brian's heart began to pound in his chest, but he tried to act like everything was fine. "Yeah, I brought him in for suspicious behavior," Brian said, his voice sounding more defensive than he meant it to. "Just doing my job." Captain Thompson looked like he was about to explode. "That," he said through gritted teeth, "is Mr. Evans. He's the head of internal affairs." Brian's stomach dropped. His mouth went dry, and for the first time, he felt truly afraid. Internal affairs. The people who investigate cops. The people who can end careers. Mr. Evans was the last person Brian wanted to arrest, and now the weight of his mistake was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He glanced back at Mr. Evans, who was still watching him with that same calm, unsettling gaze. There was no anger on Mr. Evans' face, no panic, just quiet control. It was as if Mr. Evans already knew how this would end, and it terrified Brian. I didn't know," Brian stammered, trying to recover. "I was just following protocol." He looked suspicious. Suspicious. The captain's voice was sharp. "You just arrested the one man who can take you down. You'd better pray he's in a forgiving mood." Brian swallowed hard, his mind racing. How had he messed this up so badly? He glanced back at Mr. Evans, but the man still said nothing. The silence was suffocating. Brian forced a smile, trying to play it cool. "Look, Captain, it's all a misunderstanding. I didn't realize who he was." The captain shook his head. "You're in deep now, Brian. Real deep." Brian's heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to Mr. Evans. He felt his whole world tilting. The smug confidence he had carried just hours ago, now crumbling to pieces. Mr. Evans hadn't said a word, but his silence was louder than anything Brian had ever heard. And in that silence, Brian realized his life was about to change forever. Officer Brian sat in a small room, his foot tapping nervously under the table. The quiet hum of the station outside the door was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He couldn't stop sweating. His hands trembled as he wiped his forehead, trying to pull himself together. Across from him sat Mr. Evans, still calm, still composed, his eyes steady on Brian, as if he could see right through him. Brian avoided his gaze, staring down at the table, desperately trying to think of a way out. He had to fix this. He had to. "Look, Mr. Evans," Brian started, his voice shaky but trying to sound confident. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. Following orders, you know." Mr. Evans didn't blink. He simply folded his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, his voice cool and measured. "Following orders," he repeated. Interesting choice of words. Brian gulped, feeling the tension in the room growing thicker by the second. He forced a nervous smile, still trying to act like everything was fine. "Yeah, you know how it is. A lot of guys around here, we just go by our gut feelings. You looked, well, suspicious. That's all it was." Mr. Evans didn't respond at first. The silence stretched out, making Brian's heart race even faster. Then, slowly, Mr. Evans reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. He placed it on the table between them with a soft thud that made Brian's skin crawl. "I know everything about you, Officer Brian," Mr. Evans said quietly, his eyes never leaving Brian's face. Brian froze. His eyes darted to the file, his stomach twisting into knots. The room seemed to get smaller, the air heavier. "Whoa, what do you mean?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Evans calmly opened the file, flipping through the pages as if he had all the time in the world. "Your record," he said, turning one page after another. "Complaints of harassment, incidents involving excessive force, nearly every one of them involving people of color, all swept under the rug by your superiors. But not anymore." Brian felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He couldn't breathe. His world was spinning out of control. How could Mr. Evans know all of this? He had been so careful, so untouchable. This is crazy, Brian blurted out, his voice cracking. None of that was ever proven. I've never been charged with anything. Mr. Evans looked up from the file, his expression unreadable. You think that matters? He asked quietly. Do you think those people you've hurt care whether or not you were charged? Brian's hands gripped the edge of the table. His mind was racing, desperate to find a way out, but every excuse he thought of crumbled before he could even say it. He had never felt like this before, this kind of fear. This was the end, and he knew it. You've spent years abusing your power, Officer Brian, Mr. Evans continued, his voice steady. And now, it's caught up to you. Brian shook his head, trying to regain control, but his voice betrayed him. I didn't know. I was just doing what everyone else was doing. Mr. Evans leaned back in his chair, closing the file but keeping his hand on it. His eyes bore into Brian's, not with anger, but with something much more frightening. Certainty. I'm going to launch an investigation into you, Mr. Evans said, each word sharp and clear. And when I'm done, there will be no more excuses, no more hiding. You'll be held accountable for every action you've taken. The room was deathly silent. Brian's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. His whole career, his life, was slipping away before his eyes. He had always felt invincible, protected by the badge and the system. But now, sitting across from the one man who could destroy him, he realized just how fragile that protection had been. For the first time in his life, Brian felt true fear, and there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. The weight of Mr. Evans' words sank deep into Brian's mind, wrapping around his thoughts like chains. His career wasn't just at risk, his very freedom was on the line. And there was no way out. The walls of the small room felt like they were closing in on Officer Brian. His heart pounded in his chest, sweat dripping down his face. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking. The weight of what Mr. Evans had just said hung in the air, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. I made a mistake, Brian stammered, his voice desperate and weak. I didn't know. I didn't mean for this to happen. Mr. Evans sat quietly, watching him. He didn't say a word, just leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly resting on the file that held all of Brian's darkest secrets. The silence was unbearable. Brian could feel his fear twisting into knots inside his stomach. I didn't know who you were, Brian continued, his voice shaking. If I had known, I never would have. He stopped himself, realizing too late that his words weren't helping. He wasn't just begging for his career. He was begging for his life as he knew it. He was starting to understand just how deep of a hole he had dug for himself. Mr. Evans still said nothing, his eyes locked on Brian's, making him sweat even more. The silence was like a ticking clock, counting down the moments until his life would fall apart. I messed up, Brian whispered, his voice trembling now. His usual bravado was completely gone. Please, you have to understand. I didn't think it was that bad. I didn't know. But as those words left his mouth, memories started flooding back, uninvited. He remembered the faces, those people he'd arrested without cause, the way he'd abused his power just because he could. The men he'd shoved into the back of his patrol car for no reason, the families he had torn apart. And always, they had looked like Mr. Evans, people of color who never stood a chance once Brian set his sights on them. Flashes of those moments, those actions he had justified at the time, came crashing into him now. The look of fear in their eyes, the confusion, the helplessness, how he had felt so powerful, so untouchable, thinking he was doing his job when deep down, he knew he wasn't. He had enjoyed that power. But now, sitting across from Mr. Evans, Brian realized what he had become, and the guilt, something he had kept buried for so long, began to claw its way to the surface. His voice cracked. I'm sorry, I really am. I didn't know what I was doing. Please, please give me another chance." Still, Mr. Evans said nothing, his silence stretching on, making Brian feel like he was slowly unraveling. Each second of that silence made his guilt weigh heavier on his chest. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to fix this. He had to get out of this nightmare. "Look," Brian begged, leaning forward, his voice trembling. "I'll change. I'll do better. Just drop this investigation. I can't lose everything. My career, my family. I'll lose it all." Mr. Evans raised an eyebrow, but still didn't speak. The pressure was unbearable now, and Brian's fear was turning into pure desperation. He could see his entire life crumbling in front of him, and he had no one to blame but himself. For so long, he had felt invincible, untouchable, but that had all been an illusion. "I'll do anything," Brian whispered, his voice barely audible. "Anything. Just give me another chance." For a long moment, Mr. Evans remained silent, his gaze steady. Brian could feel himself sweating even more, his throat tightening as he waited, hoping for some shred of mercy. But the silence stretched on, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Finally, Mr. Evans leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Brian. "You want a second chance," he said quietly, his voice calm but full of meaning. "What about all those people you denied that chance to?" Brian's heart sank. He had no answer. The faces of those he had wronged flashed through his mind again, each one a reminder of the damage he had done. He could feel the walls closing in tighter now, and the weight of his guilt felt like it was going to crush him. Then Mr. Evans spoke, his voice calm but filled with a quiet authority. "I believe in justice, Officer Brian," he said, leaning forward slightly. His eyes, sharp and focused, locked onto Brian's. "But I also believe in second chances." Brian blinked, unsure if he had heard him correctly. A second chance. The words didn't make sense at first. After everything he had done, after all the people he had hurt, how could Mr. Evans even consider giving him a way out? Mr. Evans continued, "You've made serious mistakes. You've abused the power that was given to you to protect and serve. And you've hurt people, many people, because of your own prejudice." Brian's stomach twisted as Mr. Evans listed his sins so plainly. The guilt weighed heavier with each word. "But," Mr. Evans said, his tone softening just slightly, "I believe people can change. I believe in second chances, when they're deserved." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I'm giving you that second chance, Brian." Brian's heart skipped a beat. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with a deep sense of fear. He wasn't off the hook, not completely. He knew that much. The way Mr. Evans was looking at him, it was clear that this wasn't just forgiveness. It was a test he couldn't afford to fail. Mr. Evans leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But let me make one thing very clear," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "From this moment on, you will be watched. Every move you make, every decision, will be under scrutiny. If you step out of line even once, just once, there will be no second chances. You will lose everything." Brian swallowed hard, the gravity of Mr. Evans' words settling in. He had narrowly escaped ruin, but the weight of what lay ahead was crushing. He had to change. He had to do better. There was no room for mistakes. "You understand me?" Mr. Evans asked, his eyes still locked on Brian's. Brian nodded quickly, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. I understand. I won't let you down." Mr. Evans didn't respond right away. He simply stared at Brian for a long moment, as if assessing him, deciding whether or not he was truly worthy of this second chance. Then, finally, he gave a slight nod. "You're free to go," he said quietly. Brian stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with a deep sense of regret and fear. He had come so close to losing everything, and even though he had been given a second chance, the path ahead felt uncertain. Every step from here would be under a microscope, and he knew that if he slipped up, there would be no mercy. As he walked out of the station, the cool air hit his face, but instead of feeling free, Brian felt the weight of his decisions press down harder. He had always believed he was above the consequences of his actions, but now, everything had changed. His future was no longer in his hands. It was in the hands of every choice he would make from this moment forward. Brian glanced back at the station, knowing Mr. Evans was still inside, probably watching. The fear hadn't left him. It lingered, a constant reminder that this second chance came with a price. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. With a deep breath, Brian walked down the street, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he realized that the path he chose from here would decide everything. And the question that haunted him now was simple: could he really change? If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on future content. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more exciting stories with you.